The Northampton Veterans Affairs Medical Center in western Massachusetts sat quietly among the rolling hills of the Pioneer Valley. Flanked by groves of birch and maple trees, the campus resembled more a sleepy college than a federal hospital. The red brick buildings, some dating back to the early 20th century, bore the weathered marks of time, peeling paint, rusted gutters, ivy climbing the outer walls as if nature sought to reclaim them. On foggy mornings, when mist clung to the treetops and the dew made the grass shimmer like glass, the facility took on an almost eerie stillness, as though it had long been waiting for something to happen. In the early 1990s, life at the Northampton VA moved at a languid, predictable pace. Most of the patients were elderly men, veterans from World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, whose bodies were worn down by time, disease, and the quiet devastation of memory. The sounds of the hospital were subtle and repetitive, the shuffle of slippers against linoleum, the low hum of fluorescent lights, the occasional crackle from a nurse's radio. It was not a place where excitement lived, nor where it was wanted. Tranquility was the rule, and any deviation from it was treated as a threat to the system. The staff were used to this rhythm. They were mostly locals, nurses, orderlies, and administrative workers who had either grown up nearby or had settled in the area to escape the noise of more urban settings. The turnover rate was low. People didn't leave unless they retired. The nurses, in particular, were known for their compassion and commitment, many of them serving in the same wards for years. They knew their patients by name, knew their habits, knew their war stories, even the ones the veterans told only when the lights were low and sleep wouldn't come. And among them all, one nurse stood out. Kristen Gilbert joined the staff in 1989, young and striking in both appearance and demeanor. She was tall, with dark, expressive eyes and a presence that seemed to command attention without demanding it. Her posture was perfect, her steps purposeful. Everything about her suggested confidence, poise, and capability. Patients responded to her immediately, some flirted with her, others simply found comfort in her presence. Veterans who had once been combative or withdrawn became oddly compliant in her care. She spoke softly, rarely raised her voice, and always appeared in control. Her colleagues admired her. Doctors praised her clinical acumen, her swift decisions during emergencies, and her seemingly innate ability to remain calm under pressure. She had an intuition about patients that bordered on the uncanny. Supervisors took note of her, too. Kristen was the type of nurse that made a unit run smoothly. If she was scheduled for a shift, the evening would go better. Fewer complaints. Fewer errors. Her personnel file described her as diligent, dependable, a model employee. But perfection has a way of inviting scrutiny. And sometimes, the quietest places hide the darkest things. At first, it was nothing more than a strange coincidence. A patient who had been stable for days would suddenly take a turn for the worse. A code blue would be called late at night, often during the same shifts. The patients who died were usually older, often with complicated medical histories. Nothing unusual, on paper. After all, this was a hospital for aging war veterans, many of whom were terminal or struggling with chronic illness. But the numbers began to shift. Where once the facility might lose 1 or 2 patients in a month, the deaths began to occur weekly. Then more frequently. And they seemed to cluster around certain times. Certain shifts. Certain names on the duty roster. Nurses whispered about it during smoke breaks behind the loading dock, their words hushed, as though saying them too loudly might make them real. Still, no one wanted to believe something was wrong. Not really. Not with Kristen. She was always there when something happened, running into the room, calling for help, administering CPR, checking vitals. She reacted faster than anyone else. She was the one calling codes, the one who first noticed irregularities on monitors, the one who tried to resuscitate the unresponsive. No one could accuse her of negligence. If anything, she seemed almost too vigilant. Yet questions lingered. One nurse, Janice Miller, had worked at the VA for nearly a decade. She prided herself on knowing her patients well and had a sharp memory for detail. One morning, after yet another unexpected death on Ward C, she sat alone in the break room, stirring her coffee and staring out the window at the leafless trees beyond. "That's the third one this week," she muttered aloud, not to anyone in particular. "Fourth," said a voice behind her. Janice turned to see Paul Green, a respiratory therapist, leaning against the doorway. He looked tired, the bags under his eyes darker than usual. "Who was the fourth?" she asked. "Mr. Donnelly, last night. Code blue at 3:10 a.m. They tried everything. Didn't make it." "Jesus," Janice said. "He was doing okay yesterday. Stable vitals. Talking, even." Paul nodded. "I know. I saw him during rounds." "Who was on?" Paul hesitated, then said, "Kristen." Janice didn't respond immediately. She just stared back out the window, the gears in her head slowly turning. No one wanted to say it. Not yet. At staff meetings, supervisors offered platitudes about how patient decline is sometimes unpredictable, especially in a long-term care facility. When questioned about the spike in mortality, administrators reminded staff of the patient's ages and complex medical conditions. "We deal with fragile populations," they said. "These things happen." And maybe they were right. Maybe. But the veterans themselves seemed to sense something, too. Some of the more lucid patients started requesting transfers to different wards. One man refused to let Kristen check his form, snapping at her with unusual aggression. Another insisted on being discharged early, despite being warned it could be dangerous to leave. "I'm not staying here another night," he told his son. "Not while she's on." The son didn't understand. No one did. But the old man was insistent. What no one outside the facility knew, what few even inside it truly grasped, was that the pattern had begun. A pattern that would soon stretch across months, claiming lives without explanation, wrapped in the sterile language of medical uncertainty. For now, the deaths were just whispers. Small tragedies explained away by age and illness. But death has a rhythm, and this one was out of tune. Kristen Gilbert continued to work her shifts with grace and efficiency. She continued to win praise, to earn the trust of those around her. And as the fog rolled over the hills each morning, curling through the bare trees and pressing against the windows, the hospital held its breath. Because something had changed. And it had started with the dead. By 1995, the tranquility that once defined the Northampton VA had begun to fracture. It started slowly, almost imperceptibly, an odd call here, a sudden code blue there. At first, no one wanted to see the pattern. But the numbers told their own story. Between late 1995 and into the following year, a wave of emergencies swept through the medical center. The calls for resuscitation, code blues, became unnervingly frequent. What had once been a rare event, met with urgency and coordinated chaos, was now common enough to feel routine. Nurses stopped asking if a code would happen on a given night. They began asking when. The shift that drew the most attention was the 3 to 11 p.m. swing, quiet hours when daylight faded and the hospital slipped into a more vulnerable state. Less staff, fewer administrators. A skeleton crew watching over fragile lives. And yet, it was during these hours that tragedy struck the most. Night after night, alarms would blare down the halls, flatlines, erratic heartbeats, gasps from patients who had been laughing or resting peacefully moments before. Doctors were paged. Crash carts were wheeled in. Chest compressions began, IVs were flushed, medications were pushed. Sometimes the patients came back. Often, they didn't. But what unsettled the staff the most wasn't the frequency. It was the faces. These weren't the typical deaths expected in a long-term care facility. These weren't the men already slipping away, whose names were already penciled into hospice charts or discussed gently with family members. No, These were patients who had been stable, recovering, laughing with aides just hours earlier. Men who were eating dinner, playing cards in the rec room, asking when their grandchildren would visit. Some were even preparing for discharge. Then, without warning, they were gone. Veterans who had survived war, injury, and years of chronic illness were suddenly collapsing in their beds, gasping for breath, their hearts stopping with no warning. And over time, as the ward walls echoed with the steady rise of code blues, the same name kept surfacing. Not in official reports, not on the overhead speakers, but in hushed conversations behind closed doors. Kristen. It seemed that every shift she worked ended in tragedy. The first to truly notice were the other nurses. They were too experienced not to catch the signs. Linda French, a senior nurse with 30 years of experience, began quietly logging deaths in her day planner. She didn't write anything more than a name and a time, just enough to track the pattern. It was subtle at first, spread out over weeks. But as winter deepened and 1996 rolled in, the pages filled faster. Linda's pen moved with growing unease. The security staff noticed too. The orderlies. Even the janitorial crew, who came in at the end of the shift to mop the rooms, began to joke, nervously, that death seemed to follow Kristen around. It was hard to reconcile the Kristen they knew with the implications of what they were feeling. After all, Kristen Gilbert was still the golden nurse. She remained calm during emergencies. She was the one who usually found the patients first, who called for help while others scrambled. She performed CPR with fierce determination, her voice steady even as chaos unfolded around her. She stayed late, covered extra shifts. No one wanted to question her dedication. And yet, there was something unnatural about her presence during those moments. Something eerie. She was always nearby, as though anticipating the exact moment a patient would flatline. She'd show up outside the room seconds before the alarm sounded, sometimes already holding gloves or preparing a syringe. And while others around her seemed shaken by the mounting toll, Kristen remained composed, cool, almost clinical. Never surprised. Not even once. Rumors began to bloom in the quiet places, the break room, the stairwells, whispered across the nurses' station like guilty secrets. Some said she craved attention. That the adrenaline of emergency gave her a kind of high. Others suggested darker motives. One night, an orderly named Mike, who had always kept to himself, muttered something beneath his breath as another patient died on Kristen's shift. Angel of Death, he said, not looking up. The name caught on. It was never said around Kristen. Never to her face. But it traveled. Like a rumor, or a warning. Still, no one went to the administrators. Not at first. There were no accusations, only suspicions. No evidence, only statistics. And Kristen had built her reputation carefully. To challenge her without proof would be career suicide. Besides, she was still Kristen. Charming. Professional. She brought homemade cookies to the nurses' lounge. She stayed late to help with charting. She remembered birthdays. Even when people began to suspect, they found themselves questioning their own doubts. Was it paranoia? Coincidence? The randomness of aging bodies finally giving up? Or was it something else? Some staff tried to forget what they were feeling, to push it down and focus on their work. But others began to watch more closely. They began to document, record, ask subtle questions. And though no one dared say it aloud, one truth grew harder and harder to ignore. Where Kristen Gilbert walked, death was never far behind. It was Deborah Hedges who finally broke the silence. For months, she'd watched the hospital teeter on the edge of something unspoken. She was the chief pharmacist at Northampton VA, a quiet but meticulous woman with a mind for details and a low tolerance for chaos. She believed in systems, orders, ledgers, logs. She trusted math. Math didn't lie. And lately, the math wasn't adding up. She first noticed it during a routine audit in early 1996. A discrepancy. Small, but strange, a missing vial of epinephrine. Then another. And another. Always unrecorded, always unexplained. The logs had no documentation of them being dispensed. The paper trail simply stopped. But Deborah knew her inventory, and she knew when something was off. Epinephrine was not a casual medication. It was powerful, used only in emergencies, to jumpstart a failing heart. Normally, it was tightly monitored, double-checked, and logged precisely. Nurses didn't just take it. And it certainly didn't just vanish. She began looking back through the usage logs, pulling patient charts, piecing together a puzzle that no one else seemed willing to examine. The pattern that emerged chilled her. The missing epinephrine always corresponded to code blues. And the code blues always happened on the same shift. Kristen's shift. At first, Deborah said nothing. She couldn't accuse a nurse, especially not that nurse, on a hunch. Kristen was still a star in the eyes of many, competent, reliable, admired. But the numbers grew. And the deaths kept coming. By late spring, the whispers that had long echoed through the hospital corridors turned into something sharper, something urgent. Nurses who had once joked nervously now spoke with dry voices, their eyes scanning shift rosters with dread. Some began requesting transfers, off the 3 to 11 shift, off Ward C entirely. "I can't do this anymore," one nurse confided to Deborah in the supply room, her voice low, trembling. "It's like, we're waiting for someone to drop. Every night. And it's always when she's here." Another nurse left an anonymous note in a supervisor's inbox. It was only one line. "When she's on, patients die." It was short, but it said everything. The hospital administrators, who had spent months brushing aside concerns with bureaucratic platitudes and statistical rationalizations, could no longer ignore the smoke. There was too much of it. Death was one thing in a veterans' hospital. An internal investigation was opened quietly, without press or panic. Staff were interviewed. Logs were reviewed. Pharmacy audits were pulled in full. Kristen's patient records were examined under a new lens. And that summer, in July 1996, the hospital made a call. The FBI was brought in. It wasn't a public affair, not yet. But agents arrived in plain clothes and sat in unmarked vehicles outside the facility. They interviewed nurses discreetly, combed through medication inventories, tracked batch numbers, and compared them to the growing list of the dead. They mapped the incidents, times, dates, victims, symptoms. The overlaps were undeniable. Kristen Gilbert's name surfaced again and again. She had been present at nearly every suspicious death. She had access to the medications. She was calm, almost disturbingly so, in the face of every emergency. And, as the FBI would later discover, she had something else too, a trail of inconsistencies in her notes, timing gaps in her whereabouts, and increasingly erratic behavior behind closed doors. The investigation was still quiet, but the walls were closing in. Kristen didn't know it yet, but her shift was nearly over. As investigators quietly peeled back the layers of Kristen Gilbert's professional life, they uncovered something unexpected. Something not in medical records or medication logs. A love story. If you could call it that. In the early months of the investigation, as agents sifted through schedules, pharmacy inventory sheets, and personnel files, a new name kept appearing beside Kristen's: James Perot. A tall, quiet hospital security guard who had worked the same shifts on more nights than could be chalked up to chance. At first, it was just another overlap. A coincidence. But soon, something stranger took shape. Co-workers remembered the shift in Kristen when James was around. It was subtle at first, a laugh that lasted too long, an extra visit to the front desk. But over time, their flirtation became difficult to ignore. The way she lit up when he entered the room. The glances exchanged in passing. The long conversations in empty hallways. She would find reasons to walk through the corridors where he patrolled, excuses to be near him. Kristen, the married mother of two, had fallen hard, and openly, for the quiet security guard. And then, the truly disturbing part. As agents laid code blue calls over shift schedules, another pattern emerged. The frequency of deaths increased when James Perot was working, too. Not just Kristen. Kristen and James. Together. It was an eerie symmetry. On nights when both were on shift, the hospital felt like it held its breath. Emergencies happened more often. Patients flatlined more suddenly. Chaos bloomed out of nowhere, then Kristen would appear, calm, commanding, saving lives or trying to. And James would be there too, often arriving just moments later to secure the area, to assist, to witness. The theory that emerged from hushed meetings between hospital officials and federal agents was both chilling and absurd. Was Kristen Gilbert manufacturing medical crises to gain the attention and admiration of her lover? Was she deliberately pushing patients into cardiac arrest just so she could play the hero? Was it a deadly form of performance, an elaborate, deranged mating call? It seemed too bizarre to be real. And yet, the evidence kept circling back. One nurse later told investigators that Kristen was different around James. Not just happier, excited, almost manic. She thrived in emergencies when he was there. She took charge. She was loud, bold. She wanted to be seen. Some suspected she wanted to be admired. By him. She was a star when the chaos hit, the nurse said. And he always seemed to be right behind her. Kristen's personal life, too, was beginning to unravel. Her marriage was strained to the breaking point. She had grown distant at home. Her husband, Glenn Gilbert, sensed something was wrong, though he had no idea just how wrong. Kristen began spending more time at work, taking extra shifts, staying late even when she wasn't needed. There were unexplained absences, evasive answers. And at the hospital, people had started to notice. She wasn't subtle, one orderly remembered. It was like, she wanted us to know. The connection between the code blues and Kristen's relationship with James gave investigators a new, darker theory. What if the deaths weren't just about attention, or a desire to feel needed? What if they were a gift? What if the ultimate thrill wasn't just in saving lives, but in orchestrating death, controlling it, bending it to her will, all with her lover watching? It was a terrifying possibility. Because if true, it meant the killings weren't random. They weren't accidents. They were staged performances. And the patients, veterans who had survived wars, outlived friends and families, were nothing more than a theater of one woman's obsession. The investigation, once rooted in missing drugs and medical logs, now had a second pulse, the psychology of Kristen Gilbert. Her motives. Her cravings. Her darkness. She was no longer just a nurse. She was becoming something else entirely. By the fall of 1996, Kristen Gilbert was no longer the glowing presence at the heart of the hospital. The eyes that once watched her with admiration now followed her with suspicion. The halls of Northampton VA, once her stage, had turned cold. Tight conversations stopped when she entered a room. Co-workers no longer smiled back. Records were being pulled. Security footage reviewed. Inventory double-checked. Kristen could feel it, like pressure on her skin. The air had changed. And then, abruptly, she was gone. In November, without warning or ceremony, Kristen Gilbert resigned from her position. Officially, she cited personal reasons. Unofficially, she knew the walls were closing in. She may have hoped that stepping away would quiet the storm. That distance would grant her invisibility. But the storm was already out of her hands. What Kristen didn't know was that the FBI had escalated their inquiry. What began as a quiet investigation had become a full-scale federal probe. The Bureau was no longer just interviewing staff or cross-checking pharmacy logs. They were digging, literally. Over the next year, several former patients were exhumed from their graves. These were men who had died quietly under Kristen's care, whose passing had been explained away as the unfortunate but unremarkable decline of aging veterans. But now their deaths were being revisited with a colder, more forensic lens. Pathologists reopened the cases. Toxicology tests were run on preserved tissue. The results were conclusive. In multiple cases, epinephrine was present in concentrations far beyond therapeutic use, levels that could only have been injected deliberately, and in doses designed not to heal but to kill. The implications were staggering. Epinephrine, when used correctly, could shock a heart back to life. But too much, especially administered to vulnerable patients, did the opposite. It flooded the heart, triggering fatal arrhythmias, chaos in the bloodstream, sudden collapse. And it left behind no obvious trace, unless you knew to look. Now, they were looking. What emerged from months of interviews, lab results, and schedule reconstructions was a near-clinical portrait of precision. Kristen's presence correlated with the missing drugs, with the flatlines, with the bodies. Every shift she worked was mapped against fatal cardiac arrests. And time after time, the same pattern repeated itself: a patient stable 1 hour, dead the next. A nurse unaccounted for in the critical minutes before. A drug vial missing. A story that didn't quite fit. It wasn't just circumstantial. It was connective. The pieces snapped together. Kristen Gilbert, the nurse once praised for her poise and competence, now stood at the center of one of the most chilling criminal investigations in the history of American healthcare. In 1998, a grand jury indicted her on 4 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. The victims were all military veterans, men who had placed their trust, and their final moments, in the hands of a nurse who was supposed to care for them. The media descended quickly, hungry for headlines. In press conferences and nightly news segments, reporters branded her with a grim moniker, the Angel of Death. It stuck. It haunted. Prosecutors were more precise. They described Kristen Gilbert as a manipulative sociopath, someone who manufactured crises to gain admiration. She injected her patients with fatal doses of epinephrine, then took command of the emergency. Her CPR was flawless. Her voice steady. To the untrained eye, she looked like a savior. But the prosecution argued she was the architect of the very disasters she worked to fix. They accused her of playing a game of life and death, not out of rage or revenge, but to be admired. To be seen. To feel something. But as the trial preparations began and psychiatric experts weighed in, a darker profile began to emerge. It wasn't just admiration she craved. It was control. She had built a world where she alone determined who lived and who died. Where chaos bent to her will, and death became a tool to wield. Her patients were not people to her, they were currency. Triggers. Applause. Kristen didn't just want attention. She wanted dominion. She wasn't playing hero. She was playing God. By early 2000, the nation was watching. What began as a whisper among nurses in a quiet Massachusetts hospital had grown into a full-blown national obsession. Kristen Gilbert, the attractive, composed, seemingly devoted VA nurse, was now the accused serial killer dubbed by the press as the Angel of. Her trial began in March of that year, held in U.S. District Court in Springfield, Massachusetts, under tight security and endless media scrutiny. For weeks, headlines blared across the country. TV trucks parked outside the courthouse. Sketch artists captured her every expression. True crime pundits dissected her case with forensic zeal. It wasn't just the horror of her crimes that fascinated people, it was the motive. How could a nurse, a mother, someone trained to save lives, commit such acts? For 7 weeks, jurors sat in silence as the prosecution built their chilling case. They called dozens of witnesses, nurses, doctors, pharmacists, and hospital administrators. One by one, they took the stand and described the pattern that had haunted the Northampton VA between 1995 and 1996, how stable patients collapsed without warning, how code blues spiked during the 3 to 11 p.m. shift, and how Kristen was always there. One nurse, voice shaking, described watching Kristen rush toward a patient moments before the code was called. Another remembered her expression, calm, almost amused, as staff frantically performed CPR. It was like, she wasn't worried, they said. She looked thrilled. Testimony after testimony painted the same unsettling portrait. Kristen wasn't just calm during emergencies, she seemed energized by them. She was always first to arrive, always eager to take charge, always composed in the chaos she may have created. Epinephrine, the prosecution explained, was her weapon of choice. A small, colorless injection. Impossible to detect without autopsy. Lethal in excess. And in case after case, toxicology confirmed her signature. The defense fought back with a different story. They claimed Kristen was a scapegoat, a convenient villain for a hospital riddled with systemic problems. Their experts argued that the deaths could have been caused by underlying conditions, by miscommunication, by chaotic and overstressed hospital routines. They suggested that errors were common, that medication sometimes disappeared due to sloppy inventory, not sinister intent. They reminded the jury that Kristen had once been praised for her care. That she had never been caught in the act. That her colleagues were relying on memory, on fear, not facts. But the facts, it turned out, were undeniable. The prosecution had charts, logs, timelines. They had motive, the disturbing thrill of playing hero, the twisted romance with a hospital security guard. They had a trail of bodies, all pointing back to one woman. And the jury believed it. On March 14, 2001, after 7 weeks of testimony and 2 days of deliberation, Kristen Gilbert was convicted on all major counts. 4 counts of first-degree murder. 2 counts of attempted murder. Each name was read aloud. Each verdict confirmed what the staff at Northampton had feared, and what the country now understood. Kristen Gilbert had betrayed her oath, her patients, and her profession in the most horrific way possible. The prosecution had sought the death penalty. In federal court, for murder on government property, it was on the table. The families of the victims sat in the gallery, hoping for justice, whatever form it might take. But after hearing emotional appeals, including from Kristen's own children, the jury opted for mercy. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Today, Kristen Gilbert resides at FMC Carswell, a federal medical center for female inmates in Fort Worth, Texas. It is a prison, but also a hospital, a place for the mentally and physically ill. She lives among others whose lives unraveled in shadow. A nurse turned killer. A woman who once ran the codes, now reduced to silence and steel bars. She will die there. But the story she left behind continues to haunt the halls of Northampton VA, where whispers still echo, and every code blue carries a trace of doubt. In the months following Kristen Gilbert's conviction, the Northampton Veterans Affairs Medical Center became a different place. New policies were drafted. Drug storage protocols were overhauled. Access to medications like epinephrine was placed under strict surveillance. Nurses and doctors were retrained in emergency detection, in recognizing irregular patterns, in trusting their instincts, even when those instincts went against the grain. Security measures increased. Background checks tightened. Staff were encouraged to report concerns without fear of retaliation. But some things couldn't be fixed with policy. The trauma lingered. For the families of the dead, there was no comfort in procedure. Their loved ones had gone to the hospital for care, not to be sacrificed on the altar of one woman's ego. For many, the courtroom conviction was only a partial victory. The damage had already been done. At a press conference not long after the sentencing, one woman stepped forward. She held a framed photo of her father, a veteran who had survived 2 wars, raised a family, and died in a hospital bed just days before his scheduled discharge. Her voice was quiet, but steady. "He served 2 wars and came back alive," she said. "And he died in a hospital bed in peace, until someone decided to play God." That line stuck. It was repeated in editorials, news specials, true crime documentaries. It captured what made Kristen Gilbert's case so terrifying, not just the murders, but the setting. A hospital. A sanctuary. A place meant for healing, turned into a silent hunting ground. For the staff who had worked beside her, the betrayal was personal. Many had trusted Kristen. Some had admired her. A few had considered her a friend. And nearly all of them had missed the signs. "She seemed so normal," one nurse later said. "She smiled. She helped. She brought cookies to the break room. And all the while, patients were dying." Kristen Gilbert never confessed. Not in the courtroom. Not in prison. Not to the press. She has never expressed remorse or acknowledged responsibility. Her attorneys maintain she was wrongfully accused, that the evidence was circumstantial, that the government needed a scapegoat.